Peace, family. It's Bakari Lumumba back once again, the progenitor of LumumbaSpeaks.com, a Black empowerment initiative where we believe we can always gain a competitive advantage by always betting on Black. Before we get started with this latest video, I want to make sure you hit the subscribe and like button. Make sure you hit the subscribe and like button. This latest video is really entitled, What is Anti-Black Racism? There's been a lot of discussions people having about what is racism, so on and so forth. There were some brothers who actually proposed this question for me at the gym. And I thought it was rather interesting because they didn't tend to really have an understanding what racism was, right? And so, of course, the conversation went about with them saying Black people can be racist. And I said, I disagree, right? We all know that Black people have the ability to be prejudiced. We also know that Black people have the ability to engage in bigotry. But racism is power plus prejudice. And so the question I always ask people when people say, can Black people be racist, is I say, give me an example of how Black racism adversely impacts the lives of white people as a group. And of course, no one can answer the question. Now, we can engage in racist language, racist rhetoric, but we don't actually have the power. We can even hate other groups of people. We can hate all the way to the bank, all the way to the courthouse, all the way to the police station, but we still don't actually have the ability to adversely impact the lives of a racial group of people as a group. And so I think it's very important that we understand that when we define and understand what racism isn't simply hating a group of people because of the color of their skin. Racism is in part is based on believing that your racial group is superior. But racism at large, by and large, is rooted in the belief and the fact and the practice of power plus prejudice, meaning you have the power to act on your prejudicial views of another group of people in a manner that adversely impacts their lives as a group. I think that is very important that we understand that, because it's very difficult to actually combat something in an efficacious manner if you don't actually know what it is you're combating. And when I say that, I like to use a sports analogy. I'm a big sports fan. For example, if you're a football quarterback, you're facing a 3-4 defense with a cover 2 in the secondary, you're not going to be able to throw a touchdown pass if you don't know what type of defense the opponent is running. And we're not going to be able to actually become victorious over racism and white supremacy if we don't understand what racism and white supremacy is. I think that is very important. Number 2, the topic of discussion for today's video is, what is anti-Black racism? So according to Dumas and Ross, great actual journal article that they wrote entitled "Be Real Black for Me." Anti-Black racism is an antagonistic relationship between Blackness and the possibility of humanity due to Black people's unfortunate history of chattel enslavement, in which, of course, we understand that slavery took place throughout the world, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, throughout Asia and Africa, but we understand that chattel enslavement was the only form of enslavement of a people, enslavement of people, in which people were denied their humanity, right? And so this is what led to what many scholars, including Orlando Patterson, has opined in his groundbreaking book, Slavery and Social Death, as this concept of social death, in which human beings are, because of the history of enslavement, aren't accepted as full human beings and by the dominant society. This is what many people argue that Black people are still fighting for today, is our right to be recognized as what? Human beings, right? Rather than simply beast of burden to where we are somehow having a negative effect on the forward progress of humanity, human civilization, and of course here in America, American society. It's very important that we understand that. Also, we have to understand that other people of color, right? I put air quotes on the term people of color. We understand that oftentimes when Black people begin to advocate for themselves, like we did back in the 1950s and 60s and 70s with the Civil Rights Black Power movement, and there was a push for Black self-determination in terms of the cultural aesthetic, in terms of education, in terms of beauty, and even, of course, with the push, the audacious and courageous push for Black studies that was led by Nathan Hare at San Francisco State University. It was San Francisco State College at the time, now San Francisco State University. Then they pushed what multiculturalism, right? We're even seeing that now in 2021, in which now when Black people are advocating fighting against anti-Black racism, now there's a push for people of color or minoritized people, right? And so we have to understand that we have to be very specific. Marcus Garvey always taught us race first, And we understand that, as he taught us, that what has to be done for African people at home or abroad has to be done by African people at home or abroad. And that when you allow other people to actually engage in initiatives that are supposed to empower you, oftentimes is what it turns out to be is interest convergence. And that is, of course, a situation in which, and on paper, it looks like it's going to benefit the actual Black community, but in the long run, it benefits the actual community, the people who are actually initiating the programs. One example of that, of course, is affirmative action. Many people believe with LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson's administration, when they had the Great Society proposal and they created affirmative action. Actually, I can recall LBJ actually gave a speech. He gave a commencement speech, if I remember correctly, at Howard University, where he actually talked about how he was going to create affirmative action as a great equalizer in terms of actually going after and actually helping Black people due to the histories, the history and centuries and decades of course, discrimination. And of course, we know today that the greatest beneficiary of affirmative action are white women. And as a result, that money, that wealth, those resources, those opportunities are going back to the white community, white families, etc. And so we can look at that as another example of interest convergence. So I think it's very important that we understand what we're actually dealing with if we're going to actually efficaciously combat racism, white supremacy, and most importantly, anti-Black racism. Another issue we have to understand is that other people of color can engage in and practice anti-Black racism. And I'm not going to get too much into the weeds in that regarding that today in today's video, but I think it's very important that we understand that, especially for me, someone who works in higher ed. Oftentimes, unfortunately, when we're dealing with Black students, we know higher ed is seen as a very liberal space, and so oftentimes they can infantilize students, right? We're always the victim, it's always the dominant society, and I'll argue that the two things could be right at the same time, right? It could be the dominant society engaging in racist acts, discriminatory acts, microaggressions, and it could be, hey, maybe you are a victim, or maybe, hey, you're doing something that actually has made the situation worse than it actually could be. So I think sometimes we have to bring that together and actually address these issues in a manner that's not crisis oriented. Many people ask me, what do you mean by this concept of crisis-oriented leadership? And I believe in the Black community that we know what's going on, we don't say anything, and then when there's a tragedy, when someone's shot by the police, which is very unfortunate, or there's some situation where a young man or young woman has engaged in some type of nefarious criminal act, and they're going to get 48 years. They talk about how unjust the criminal justice system is, and they want to go out in front of the courthouse or have a press conference where they're wearing their Sunday best, and they can elucidate about all of the ways that racism, white supremacy affects us in all 11 areas of human activity. However, we have to do the groundwork. When I used to box, one of the things that we always talked about is that you have to train a fighter from the ground up. And that if we want to actually develop a community that is able to be free, proud, and productive and restore ourselves to our traditional greatness, we're going to have to take that same concept of actually being very intentional in our actions and actually focusing on gaining power so that we actually have the ability to combat the issues that we're facing as a community. If not, I think we're going to continue to suffer the ravages, of course, of post-chattel enslavement, post-Jim Crow, post-Jane Crow, post-Black codes, post, of course, a situation in which we were dealing with sharecropping, and we're not going to develop as a people. We're going to have a few people that are able to, by and large, move the goalposts, as they can say, move down the field and actually have some success. But we want to look at on a macro level, what can we do as an entire group of people? So with that being said, just going to wrap up, just make sure we understand that racism isn't simply about hating someone or believing that you are superior to another group of people. Racism is about power plus prejudice, meaning you have the power to act on your prejudice and adversely impact the lives of an actual group of people, not an individual, but a group. And you're able to do this through law, politics, sex, entertainment, war, education, etc. Also, we have to understand what anti-Black racism is. Anti-Black racism is an antagonistic relationship between Blackness and the possibility of humanity due to our sordid connection in history to chattel enslavement, in which we were stripped of our humanity, not only in terms of social code, but even through the law, i.e. the U.S. Constitution. And we have to understand that we are still advocating and fighting for what our right to be recognized as human beings and to be a free, proud, and productive people, right, who are able to control our own lives and the institutions in our communities. And last but not least, in terms of combating anti-Black racism, I believe we have to be focused on having a preventive maintenance leadership model rather than a crisis-oriented leadership model. When I was in the military, one of the things that my sergeant, even my drill sergeant, going all the way back to basic training, would always state is that prior planning prevents poor performance, right? And I believe that great leadership is like great parenting. It actively prevents problems from taking place. And I believe that if we always bet on Black and we do that in a very strategic manner, we can make that a reality. So please make sure you hit the subscribe and like button. I appreciate you logging on, checking out the video. Until next time, peace.